Welcome, everyone. My name's AtKisson. I am an Assistant Director General here at Sida, and I lead the Department of Partnership and Innovation. Our Director General, Karin Jämtin, would have loved to be here, but she's at this moment in Guatemala, starting to catch up on 2 years of reduced travel to visit our operations and embassies around the world. So I'm very honored to have the opportunity to welcome you all today to this event, which brings Swedish Investors for Sustainable Development and special colleagues together to demonstrate our continued commitment to sustainable development and a healthy planet with prosperity for all. Let me extend a special welcome to the State Secretary for Swedish Development Cooperation, Ms. Jenny Ohlsson, the Deputy Director of the Stockholm Museum Center and a member of Sida's Board of Directors, Professor Victor Galaz, the head of the United Nations Environment Program Finance Initiative and the moderator of this event, Eric Usher, and the members of the Investor Alliance SISD, Swedish Investors for Sustainable Development, which is an alliance consisting of 21 large-scale investors. And I offer this welcome in the spirit of commemoration of the 1972 UN Conference on the Human Environment, which we here in Sweden lovingly refer to as the Stockholm Conference, of course. This event today is a contribution to the global dialogue leading up to the Stockholm Plus 50 conference, celebrating 50 years of global environmental action. So far as I know, this is the first public event we are hosting at Sida in connection with the Stockholm Plus 50 event. Very exciting for us. As we prepare for that Stockholm Plus 50 event, we need to take stock of what we know and what we don't know. We're hoping that working together here today, we can shed some light on what we don't know yet. That is, the way ahead. We know that we can and should celebrate progress, 50 years of growing action and cooperation. But we also know that we face mounting environmental challenges, climate change, biodiversity loss, various pollution forms, especially new forms of pollution that were less visible or even unknown to us 50 years ago. They all underscore the need to accelerate the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, including the 2030 Agenda, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, and of course, encouragement of the adoption of post-COVID recovery plans that are green in color. We know that the resources needed to accelerate sustainable development are there, but they are not yet being invested at the scale we need or in the countries who need it the most. Sida, as a partner in the SISD Alliance, as well as its convener and facilitator, has poverty reduction at the core of our mission. But we know that poverty reduction is a systemic challenge, which is a strong motivation for partnering with others toward the realization of the 2030 Agenda, the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, and of course the SDGs. We also know that the investors here today, representing so many of Sweden's largest investors, sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, insurance companies, fund managers, asset owners, as well as asset managers, also place sustainability high on the agenda and are integrating it as part of core business. Customers are asking for it. The planet needs it. We know that the SISD Alliance is a powerful demonstration of what SDG 17, the goal on partnerships, is all about. And we know that our work together in that partnership has been an inspiration to the creation of a similar global alliance, GISD, Global Investors for Sustainable Development, led by the United Nations and chaired by UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Of course, we know all too well that these are turbulent, troubling times. The last few weeks, we've seen the start of a new and dramatic conflict in Europe, with large-scale impact on global collaboration and governance. We see this happening in the light of 2 years of pandemic, a shrinking ODA commitment, rising national debts in developing countries, and financial flows that even before the pandemic were turning away from developing markets. Finally, we know with certainty that all these challenges are systemically linked. Increased inequalities are themselves a growing sustainability risk. The pandemic has increased both poverty and inequality. Climate change and its impacts on food security are amplified by rising conflict, especially in least developing countries. So it's more pressing than ever to scale up investments in climate neutral and natural ecosystems as a baseline condition for sustainable development. So we know that the discussions taking place here today have never been more relevant, not the least with regard to the role of active ownership in a just transition, the role of reporting and transparency, the role of blended finance, and turning the tide on investment flows to developing economies. And we know that all of you, both the organizations that you represent, but also as individuals, are already doing so much to address these challenges. So much for what we do know. During our time together today, we'll be also exploring things we do not yet know. What more we can do together. How to be bolder, even, or perhaps especially, during a particularly challenging time. And other more specific and challenging questions that can only be answered if we take them on together in partnership. So with that, let me welcome up to the microphone Victor Galaz, Deputy Director of the Stockholm Resilience Center. And Victor, you're going to help us set the scene for today's dialogue. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Alan, can you hear me okay? Yeah. Do we have a clicker or not? Maybe. Oh, there you go. Thank you. But no clicker, right? Okay. So I'm going to click myself. Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Sida. Thanks to the Investor Network for inviting me. I mean, I only have a couple of minutes. So I thought what I would do is just to summarize what I believe are 5 key insights or key messages for you to bring along when you discuss what would be a potential contribution from this network to the Stockholm Plus 50 process. Some of these insights might be a little bit harsh, so it might hurt a little, but I think the purpose is just to get this discussion going in a constructive and creative way. So the first insight, as I see it from my point of view as a sustainability scientist and climate scientist, of course, you've seen the IPCC reports, you probably read the second report from the Working Group 2, is the sense of urgency. So climate change is here, it's happening already, and we're seeing detrimental impacts already before the 1.5 degree target. And it's hitting the most vulnerable communities already. You know this, I'm not going to repeat it, but an important observation from a science point of view is the fact that the discussion about trying to build back better after the pandemic did not materialize at all. In fact, all investment packages that we have been seeing from governments and the private sector, but mainly from governments, actually have a smaller percentage of investments in climate-friendly technologies compared to other economic crises. So there's something in here, in the way we have set up our economies, the way the political systems are operating, that are not allowing us to build up better. So how can we make sure to break that pattern ahead or in discussion about Stockholm Plus 50? Another worry that I have, and again, this is going to hurt a little bit, I've been doing some work in the last years together with colleagues about the role and influence the financial sector have on one of the major sleeping giants in the climate system, the Amazon. And we were very happy to see some mobilization from the finance sector in 2019 related to the big forest fires and deforestation in 2019. And I think UNPRI was involved in that. So for example, that investor letter. So we were very delighted to see that. But on the other hand, in the years after, it was clear that some of these promises from some of these investors were not followed through at all. Some of these investors even failed to have their own deforestation policies in place after a couple of years. So for me, any declaration or collaboration from the finance sector needs to deliver and not just promise. I think all eyes are on the sector now, and you will be critically looked at after what has happened in the Amazon, but also after COP26. So don't just promise, please deliver as well. A third point that I think is important and something that I talk a lot about with colleagues is that there is an emphasis in this discussion about volumes of investments on the volume of green bonds or volumes of investments on climate-friendly policies. But we tend to forget underlying structural challenges that we're facing in the real reality. I'm give you an example. This is a summary. It's an article from last year that was published in an academic journal called Nature, Ecology, and Evolution that looked at finance for biodiversity to reach the biodiversity targets. And to me, that's a good proxy of how the finance sector is contributing to changes on our planet, both climate, land use change, ecosystem services, etc. There's a figure there that I find interesting. It's a little bit messy now, so I'm just going to run it through very quickly. What the authors note, and I think is important, is the fact that we're looking and talking a lot about how we can fill the funding gap to reach specific biodiversity targets or other types of climate-friendly targets. But at the same time, what we're seeing is the fact that these harmful subsidies or harmful investments are still there, and in some aspects still increasing. So how do we make sure that we not only boost the volume of investments into good activities, but also rapidly de-invest or remove capital from harmful activities? Another point that I think they made, which is much more complicated, and of course this is not the responsibility of the sector and people here in the room, but as context, is the fact that there are structural challenges in the way that governments are managing financial flows at the moment. So for example, the loss of tax income because of aggressive tax planning in some of these sectors. In some instances, in these extractive sectors, like mining or logging or forestry, which are systematically avoiding tax, which creates some big challenges. And these flows, or lack of flows of capital, are creating the context and the challenges that we're facing now. A fourth point that I think is important, and again going to the Amazon that we have been studying in detail, is the fact that the planet in the future is going to look very different from what we used to. It will move into a very different phase. And the Amazon and changes in the Amazon rainforest will have impacts that are larger than just on that region. So we know it will change weather patterns, it will change precipitation patterns, it will have impacts on the global climate system. So we're seeing these complex interactions between climate, ecosystems, and biodiversity all the time. And of course, those are connected to your sector, to the financial sector, in ways that we don't fully understand. So what is the state of knowledge? We're conducting a literature review ahead of Stockholm Plus 50. We're looking to over 200 publications. And one of the main insights of that synthesis that we haven't published yet is that the literature at the moment is just focusing on climate risks and not on these domino risks. There are a few publications and groups looking into that. So both data and methods and models at the moment are just integrating climate risks, but ignoring the risk from land use change, biodiversity loss, ocean acidification, all other things that are changing on our planet. And another thing that we're noting is that there are huge geographical gaps. So the data models insights are mainly for the US and Europe, but we're failing to see these domino effects or assess them for vulnerable countries or big economies. So that's a massive gap, something that we need to consider. So what do we make out of this? So my fifth point, and just to wrap up, this is a huge opportunity for a group like this to step up and do something different and better and more ambitious. I think in Swedish it would be skott på öppet mål, if you move this properly. And what would that mean? I mean, it means building that type of alliance or ambition that recognizes the urgency and that we're moving into a very uncertain future. Things that will happen, we can't quantify, the risks that we won't be able to quantify, but we still need to act on. The other thing is that we need to think about these structural challenges, even though they're very difficult. So things like lack of capacities in countries to manage financial flows, aggressive tax planning, corruption, etc. It's not your responsibility, but it's a context that you need to operate in. The third point, which I think is important and will become increasingly important, act in a way where you're accountable and where you deliver on past commitments. You need to keep that in mind. It's not enough to just say we're going to do this, because there have been so many failed commitments in the past that people will look at what you're doing in detail. And then the last point is that an agenda that is not only about minimizing impacts, minimizing climate impacts or minimizing biodiversity impacts, but actually at its core has the purpose to allow people and planet to thrive. So a positive agenda, that what would be needed. So I'm really looking forward to hear the results of your discussions and see whether there is a potential to do something ambitious for Stockholm Plus 50. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor. Sobering but important scientific basis for our conversation to come. On the one hand, it makes me glad that we do what we do at Sida, for example, working on anti-corruption at a systemic and institutional level. And also glad, though, that we have a meeting like this, where we're exploring strengthening public-private partnerships of various kinds, shooting at an open goal. It's hard work, but easy to do better than we've done before, I think was one of the things you're suggesting to us. But to hear more about the importance of these issues, I'd like to invite now our State Secretary for Development Cooperation, which I think Jenny Ohlsson, Victor's words underscore even more the importance of the public-private sector cooperation. So I hand the floor to you.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, I suppose. Yes, it is good afternoon. I'm really happy to be here with you today. I'm sure you would have been even happier if my boss, Minister of Development Cooperation, would have been here, but she assigned me to do this since she's in Moldova in connection to the Ukraine situation. Because of the situation there right now with lots of refugees and you know, she had to go on a trip, but she asked me to take this meeting. I'm going to read her speech, and I think that is a sign of the importance that the government puts in your commitment and what you do. So, plus personally, I'm really happy to be here because I've heard about this work for a long time, so to meet you is a bonus for me too. So the government of Magdalena Andersson has been in place now in Sweden for 100 days. And my Minister for International Development Cooperation, she was given a strong mandate to tackle the multiple crises at hand, the health crisis, of course, after the pandemic or during the pandemic, the climate and biodiversity crisis, and also that you mentioned the inequality crisis. Sadly, we can now add another crisis to this group, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and all the consequences that comes from that. When it comes to consequences, I don't know if you heard Secretary General of the UN today mention that it was about 30% of the wheat production that is globally that comes from Russia and Ukraine. When you look at 18 really poor countries, including Egypt, Yemen, DRC, Somalia, Sudan, they have about 50% of their wheat production coming from Ukraine and Russia. So we're talking about effects here on a global scale that are not just regional. So, on that not so happy note, that is of course something that demands immediate attention and immediate financing. We need to, and Sida also has worked now with how to deal with very urgent needs that comes because of the crisis. But of course, alongside with that, there is a number of other issues that demands political commitment and economic resources. First of all, the pandemic is still not over. We know this, but personally myself, I've let go a little bit of focusing on the pandemic these last couple of weeks. So when I read here in the speech that only the last week, 60,000 people have lost their lives due to COVID-19. 60,000 in 1 week. So I think it's a strong sign that we're still living with a pandemic. And Sweden has acted forcefully from the start. We are today one of the countries that have contributed the most to securing access to vaccines. Secondly, health issues, as was also mentioned, is of course also linked to climate-related issues. I mean, the risk of pandemics and climate-related illnesses is increasing as the climate and biodiversity crisis is growing day by day. So the recent IPCC report shows that we are very close to completely losing the ability to stop climate changes. And the Swedish government is determined to do its bits here, including by doubling our overall climate financing and also use it as leverage to make others scale up. to mitigate and assist countries in their green transition, but increasingly also to help the most vulnerable countries to adapt to the new reality and save lives and livelihoods that are priorities for us. So thirdly, and I don't know why I say this thirdly, it's the overarching goal of what we do, also the fight against poverty and our work for poverty reduction. It has been hampered both by the pandemic and by the climate crisis, affecting many people, especially women and girls. And Sweden works, of course, that you know, very actively to promote gender equality through the entire development agenda, policy level, also financially. And I think one thing is clear here. All the governments in all over Europe and many other places struggle to find resources to deal with these new and growing challenges. And the work that you and your network is doing is or will be more important than ever. I think that is very clear. Attaining the 2030 agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals and achieving a successful green transition, I mean, it will require sustainable investments and mobilization of private capital at much higher levels. New innovative partnerships and models are needed. We talked about that a bit earlier. SISD is an excellent example of this and of this kind of cooperation. And we are so grateful to Sida and Director General Karin, who is not here, for the active involvement in setting it up. So within the framework of our development cooperation, Sweden works in a catalytic way to mobilize other actors' engagement and financing to enable the green transition, or the green just transition, as I want to mention also. Let me highlight a few examples here. We're part of the Champions Group for Adaptation Finance, central platform for countries, international financial institutions, and other actors who strive to increase the quantity, the quality, and the access to adaptation finance in line with the development countries' needs and priorities. And this is done by leading by example, for example, 50-50, balance, mitigation, and adaptation. I'm sorry, I can't speak today. Adaptation. 2, engaging with development countries. 3, working with multilateral institutions to leverage funds, not least from the private sector. And 4, looking at a specific way of engaging the private sector, such as expanding disaster risk finance. And Sweden also continues, of course, our active engagement with the World Bank. We made a commitment of 9.2 billion to the replenishment of IDA last year, and we contributed actively to the bank's strengthened commitment on climate financing, which were increased from 28% to 35%. We are currently looking at different options to strengthen the bank's support to middle-income countries to accelerate green transition. And as you know, Sweden has been very proactive in pushing the World Bank to strengthen its work on private sector mobilization for increased global climate finance. And Sweden is very grateful for SISD involvement in this work, so thank you. The guarantee instrument that is managed by Sida is a powerful tool for mobilizing additional private capital for development purposes. The government sees great potential in an increased use of guarantees to accelerate the green transition in our partner countries. The government has progressively increased the ceiling for guarantees, which amount to 18 billion krona for 2022. So I would also like to highlight the work of our development finance institution, Swedfund, with the need to invest in a sustainable recovery from the pandemic and mobilize private investments. The role and relevance of development financial institutions have clearly increased. Swedfund has been a front runner in investments in renewable energy in the poorer countries, and it has a long experience of supporting portfolio companies to progress on issues such as climate and the environment, decent work, and gender equality. This year, Swedfund gets a capital injection of 1.2 billion krona. So to make sure that these transitions that we are trying to facilitate are just and that no one is left behind, we need to apply a more holistic and cooperative approach. SISD can contribute to the integration of sustainability into business practices and showcase alternatives for investors to divert from a solely profit-oriented thinking to a more impact-oriented approach, considering both means and ways of production and uses from short to long-term sustainability perspectives. Your network is very important for us as a role model for other financial actors, and not least in the global context. I think I was personally in New York when this was mentioned in the big UN meeting in September. I think it was 2 years ago. Anyway, I would like to encourage the SISD members to continue to step up its investment in sustainable development. I would also like to underline how important and really valuable that we think it is to have a dialogue with you. By working together, we stand a much better chance of actually having impact. So, looking ahead, we have 3 months from the conference Stockholm Plus 50, as was mentioned. We are determined from the government to secure a good outcome of this UN meeting, also in the current complex context. The Stockholm Plus 50 meeting will be a timely platform to bring together relevant actors and discuss means of implementation for green transition, but also from a broad development perspective. From Sweden's side, we will put particular focus on the need to scale up climate finance, not at least from the private sector. Your contribution to this would be very much welcome, and I really hope to see many of you in Stockholm on the meeting on 2 to 3rd June. We really think it's an opportunity to be visible, to show your commitment or the Swedish commitment, to inspire others. And last week I was actually in Liberia when they had the first national consultations in preparation for the Stockholm Plus 50 meeting. I was also later meeting our ambassador in Kenya, who's working very closely with Kenya, who is co-hosting the conference with us. And there's a lot of enthusiasm, side events, a lot of thinking and hopes going into this conference, and I think it will be great to participate as much as you can, and I think there's a lot of contributions and visibility there. So thank you very much. And a last word about the conference. There's a lot of environmental conferences that sometimes you leave them with a feeling of despair almost, but the aim is that this will be a conference where you also leave with some encouragement and hope, and I think you can contribute to that. So thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. Yes, contribute to hope. That's what we're here for today. Even though the picture that's been painted for us is absolutely a very challenging one, maybe it even sounds a bit impossible, but that's why we've asked Eric Usher to be the moderator for today's event, because the UNEP's Finance Initiative has already a track record of accomplishing things that seemed impossible many times in the past. So Eric, very glad that you'll be leading us in this dialogue today for the rest of the afternoon, and the floor is yours.
Great, thanks very much, Alan. Does that work? Is that on? Yeah. Okay, very good. Finally, technology mastered. Thanks very much, Jenny and Alan and Victor, and for the invitation to join you today. So as Alan said, I'm with the UN. I'm actually with the UN Environment Program, which is called the Finance Initiative, UNEP-FI. So we have our 50-year anniversary of UNEP this year. And it's quite inspiring. You might have heard, for instance, the words of Indira Gandhi when she opened the Stockholm Conference. And I think the hope and expectation of what sort of engagement nations could have working together. UNEP-FI was actually created in 1992 at the Rio Conference, when there were a number of insurance and banking organizations who attended and saw for the first time these discussions around sustainable development. What does it mean? What's happening? And the financial community realized that there was a need to feed in, learn from, and take part in these discussions. Probably the one you're most aware of, and I think you're probably mostly members of, is in 2006-07, we established the Principles of Responsible Investment. And I remain on the board of the PRI alongside, there's 2 UN representatives alongside Sandow Jambo from the Global Compact. And it's a large organization. It's about to surpass 5,000 members, representing the large majority of institutional investment globally. And subsequently, most of our work today is largely with the banking sector. The most recent large framework is Principles of Responsible Banking. I'm happy that basically all big Swedish banks are members, even some of the mid-sized ones. And we also have a framework in the insurance industry. So these are UN frameworks essentially trying to establish norms of conduct within the finance industry. The reason I mention that is because here you're with individual organizations that have your own mandates, you have your own shareholders, you have your own beneficiaries, but you're all Swedish, I think most of you are. And when I think of SISD and I think of PRI, I don't want to say David and Goliath, but the reality is, we have the very large investment universe today who has made quite a bit of progress in this area. But the reality is there are many communities within those 5,000 investors doing many things, many good things, some of the things probably not good enough or not fast enough. And usually how we understand how change happens is usually it's through smaller groups who lead the agenda in certain ways. And then if effectively done, it's not only about leadership, but it's also thinking about how do you bring the others on board. And so I think the opportunity for SISD and for Swedish investors generally to really not only lead, that's important, but also think about how do we change the rest of the investment universe? What does it take to show? And a lot of it is about proving out best practice. And essentially, does it make sense from a fiduciary perspective, from a societal perspective? Now, society is getting more complicated by the day. And from the UN, I have to start by mentioning, I assume you know well, on March 3rd, one of the largest ever and quickly decided UN resolutions was one calling on strongly deploring Russian aggression, with specifically the UN Secretary General calling for an immediate ceasefire as just one of many global leaders. And it's certainly a tragedy what's going on, and it also throws, we thought we were coming out of COVID, building out of COVID, and then we're getting into a very complicated new world. And obviously there are defense, there are refugee implications, and once again reminding us that our reliance on a resource that is fraught with so many issues, particularly in Europe today, but even wider, we need to weed ourselves off oil, gas, fossil fuels, and it's just ever clearer. And the question now is just how are we going to do it? And I think in terms of the nature of the discussions today, what role for Swedish investors in helping initiate that within Sweden and then within the global investor universe? For us, one of the very important issues is what can investors in the financial community do voluntarily, and what needs to be done by regulators. When is regulation needed? When can voluntary action suffice? And we hear a lot about that if you're in the climate university, the Paris ratchet, where nations ratchet each other up on climate ambition. We also like to talk about the ratchet between the private sector and the public sector, because we don't believe the solution lies on either side wholly. It's about the relationship between the two. And so it's not only about what you do, it's about what you communicate, what you do, and how the other side, the regulatory or the policymaking side, then continues to learn from what is possible. And we take the Tcfd climate disclosure guidance as an example. It was voluntary guidance, came from under the G20 umbrella. There's been a good breadth of uptake in terms of most large corporates today are starting to issue Tcfd climate disclosures, but we have to admit the depth of these disclosures is not sufficient. So regulators have now started to engage to learn what's been done voluntarily and then to start to put more expectations, different type of stress testing, scenario analysis and the like. We don't believe the regulators would actually have proceeded in the way they have now if it was all given to them. The voluntary leadership from the investment, from the financial, from the corporate sector has been very important to get that ratcheting process done. And I think that type of approach can be applied to most of the issues that Victor's laid out for us in terms of the environmental and social challenges that we face. Now, we're going to get into talking, trying to break apart some of these aspects today, and I would say layering on what Victor and Jenny have introduced with a couple more. I've mentioned the voluntary regulatory, what we call it a dance. The notion of materiality, we know, is also being challenged, and I think the pressure to try to come up with a more holistic view on essentially financial materiality, but also impact and the inside in and the outside in and the inside out notion of impact. Certainly in Glasgow, the announcement that IFRS would establish this International Sustainability Standards Board. So for the first time, corporates in a very centralized way will be expected to be disclosing on the impacts of their business operations. That's a very important development. I think we have to be cognizant that it's probably not going to go as fast as we want, but it's important because everybody knows that now impact is expected around the world. Whether you call it double materiality, dynamic materiality, there are different versions, but I think the notion that there's only one materiality no longer is really expected in or understood in most jurisdictions, even in the North America, Canadian, or in the US, where I think they've kind of held fast to single materiality. I think there is a slight opening up. And a big discussion today is going to be around the notion of the transition. And I think that's one of the tests because, to be frank, the transition is an environmental transition if we talk about climate change. And therefore, right away, it doesn't actually, in a narrow sense, fit the financial materiality test. And yet, all of a sudden, everybody knows they need to be focusing on it. And once again, in Glasgow, the announcement from Sunak Rishi from the UK government that they're going to expect that UK corporates start to issue transition plans. Once again, it's about this dance where the expectation is regulators are going to start pushing this, and therefore, on the corporate side, including within the financial sector, we need to get our arms around what does this mean. And of course, if you're going to talk about the transition, data, transparency, accountability, all of that is going to be key. And these are all really tough notions. It's not perfect. Today we believe it's not sufficient to sit back and say the data is not there, therefore I can't move. We have to move. And my sense in Sweden that's something that you share, but we need to break it down. At the same time, there are accusations of greenwashing, with in some cases, I think, good rationale. For us, the most important indicator is not so much that, let's say, BaFin or the SEC has opened one very important investigation into ESG greenwashing. It's not so much whether or not the company in question is guilty or not of greenwashing. It's the fact that regulators have opened an investigation into ESG. That is a change. U.S. regulator, Germany. So we can be assured that people are going to pay more attention to any statements we're making around ESG, and therefore we need the agreed methodologies, we need to have the data, the understanding, the standards, etc. And then finally, and Jenny spoke to important examples, I think, of what the Swedish government is doing, the notion of blending, or the relationship between public and private, not from a regulatory perspective, but from a development or a public-private finance perspective. And we're going to, I think, finish off later in terms of discussions about what more can be done there. I think one of the biggest challenges, and I assume you'll be quick to say that, is how do you move innovations to scale? Because part of the problem is institutional investors. It's interesting to hear about innovations, but unless they're at a certain scale, it's hard to engage. And so I think the really big challenge is what's to do there. And certainly getting outside of the Swedish context, globally or in the European scale, what do we need to start to see? What can we contribute to help move these innovations to scale? What is the new thinking? And Sweden, as I understand it, is a leader, particularly in the area of risk mitigation, the Sida guarantees. It's a very interesting tool. I think it's very healthy to have an open discussion, to be very frank. What's working? Where are challenges? What more do we need? So I think that's where I'm going to leave it off. And we're going to move into now a series of introductory presentations. Just let me get my notes here. So I'm going to call up first Javiera Ragnartz. Javiera, please come on up and to give, I think, an overview in terms of, on behalf of the SISD and the GISD committee, that you're chairing. Where do you see the positioning of what we can do today and how we can move forward?
Thank you, Eric. So, can you hear me? Yeah. So I guess I'm representing the investor community here, right? I mean, just taking off where we are today, I mean, in this time of very uncertainty and turbulence, it has become very evident that the sustainable development can be very, very fragile, right? And I believe that we need to join forces. If we are to achieve our goals that we do have it within the SISD community to create a more resilient development for this planet, if we are to achieve these goals, we need to join forces and we need to have strength in numbers, right? And we do need to collaborate, we need to share experiences, we need to share knowledge. And SISD is a very good platform, enable us to do this. And I was talking to Alan and Karin just yesterday, and you remind me that SISD was already created in 2016. I couldn't remember that. It seems like it was only about 2 years ago, so time flies, really. At that time, not all of us were members. It was a crowd that was a little bit smaller, but it has been growing since then. I think we have learned quite a lot during this period of time how to work together, in what we can collaborate. And the achievements have been many, actually. I think one of the issues that we do have in the industry is that many of us, or the investment community, has been classifying sustainability factors as non-financial issues. And I think I usually say that I have this vision, and hopefully this vision is not too far away, that one day we will not talk about sustainability issues or sustainability factors, because they will all be very much integrated into all investment processes. So all the portfolio managers and all the investors will look at sustainability issues as other financial issues, but we are not still there. I think, I mean, if you look at the World Economic Forum, they have done a ranking of the top risks that the planet is facing, and 3 of these risks are climate action failure, extreme weather, and biodiversity loss. None of them financial risk, all of them so-called non-financial risks, right? And we can clearly see that these kind of risks are increasingly affecting how business operates, how countries are evolving, but also how we as individuals are forced to adapt to all these kind of diverse risks that are affecting us. We can see that shocks from economic and financial crises, conflicts, geopolitical conflicts like the one we are experiencing right now, natural disaster, pandemic effects, and so on affect us very, very much. And to make a difference, to try to combat these risks, we need to collaborate. We need to, once again, share experiences. But we also need to work increasing transparencies. I think this is key for us in the industry and in the sector to increase transparency. Transparency is a prerequisite for accountability, and it is crucial when delivering on our promises and our commitments. We, as investors, also like to see that our efforts results in change. We are very much driven by looking at the results, seeing the results, achieving results. And we can see that many countries, especially in the developed part of the planet, are facing challenges. And global inequalities have increased dramatically through the pandemic, and the geopolitical crisis with the Russia invasion of Ukraine is not making it better, it's making it much worse. When we are here standing today, we do not know the effects that we will see in the future, but we are quite certain that that this will affect the developing part of the world. We will see starvation in many countries that are already affected. So it is more important than ever to be able to finance sustainable transitions in all parts of the world. And solutions can be found strengthening and developing and supporting public policies. One of them is the EU Green Deal, for instance, regulatory frameworks like the EU taxonomy. We can work with product development. This is something that has been a topic for intense discussion in SISD. It is difficult finding one product that suits all kind of investor and asset owners. But I think as a community, as an investor community, every day, I dare to say that, at least in the Swedish investor community, every day we try to allocate capital to more sustainable investments. And we do that in all asset classes and in all levels. Right? Yes, we do. But it is also important to try to explore the untapped potential we have of public and private collaboration and blended finance. Eric, could you touch upon the subject? I think it is very important that we find ways for investors to be able to engage in these projects. And I do think that the developing banks need to play a bigger role here. We need these institutions to take the risk that we as investors cannot take. We can take financial risk, but we are not really able to take other kinds of risk. So if we want to increase investments in this area, we need to work better together. And I think hopefully you will, during this afternoon, reach some very good conclusions on the themes. So, I mean, concluding, as an investor in a country like Sweden that has been very much on the forefront of sustainable investing, I think we need to continue to use our collective knowledge and experience to inspire our global colleagues. We are doing that. I mean, SISD has been inspiration for a global platform as well. So it is, I'm very proud of that, being part of that. But we need to continue doing that. We need to continue to push regulators. We need regulations to come along with private investments. The private industry will not solve it all. We need politicians to do their part as well. And we need to see that nobody is left behind. So I am really confident that SISD will continue to play a major role in providing us in the investor community with a platform where we will be able to collaborate, to change experiences, and to continue this work. And with that, I wish you a very fruitful panel discussions and afternoon, and hopefully you will come up with many solutions to how to evolve the Swedish sustainable development agenda. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Javiera. And I mean, there are many examples, but those outside Sweden, when we think about the SEB's role and the Swedish investors' role in launching the green bonds market, I think it's a really nice example of how there's a commonality of something which sounds very Swedish, but interestingly has become very global. So I think the question is, how do we further grow that, and then how do we take that approach and apply it elsewhere? Okay, so we're going to have a couple short presentations. First, Emma from AP7, and we've juggled a little bit with the groups. So we're going to go in, we're going to hear 3 views on experiences around corporate governance, and particularly, I think, the application to the transition challenge, which I think is on top of everybody's minds. We're going to pull in the 3 topics of reporting and accountability, so the data, blended finance, but within really the wider umbrella of corporate governance and the transition. Emma?
Thanks very much. Is this microphone working? Lovely. Thanks very much for the chance to talk. I had a first slide introducing AP7, just knowing that this is being filmed, but I'll just let that be on the screen and say that because we are a universal owner, we believe that we need to be a universal active owner, And that's how AP7 works primarily to achieve a more sustainable world. Our mantra really is real world impacts in everything we're trying, everything we do. That's the test. Will we get a real world impact out of this? We look at systemic issues, and we have not outsourced our active ownership. Whilst we do outsource some active ownership activities, it's not our fund managers that do our active ownership. It is AP7 who is in the reins of that process. And the active ownership toolkit looks a little bit like this, with two sort of levels, and this is not exhaustive, but just to illustrate that it is a base plate where we try to cover the whole of the market, essentially, because we are essentially invested in the whole of the market, the whole equity market. So we're looking at activities where we can influence all companies and the market itself. That involves, for example, talking to our external fund managers about what they're doing, and in particular, in work with private equity fund managers, we see that we can get quite a lot of attraction by engaging with them. It's also about talking to service providers and other activities such as our norms-based screening, which leads to a blacklisting, but is an active ownership tool because it also is very much about an engagement with the company on the topic. So that's the toolkit, the base plate of the toolkit that covers all companies. But then what we also do is have this overlay, which is much more deep diving into a much shorter list of companies in terms of engagement dialogues, thematic engagements. And now we're working more with enhancements to our voting that really include engagement and ramp up our active ownership with a number of companies that we see as laggards. So maybe in the group later we'll talk about some of these tools a little bit more, but I was asked to give a few sort of practical examples of what we're doing. So I thought I'd talk a bit about what we're doing with climate governance in our voting. So we own over 3,000 companies, part of 3,000 companies globally, and they all have their annual meetings and their extra meetings, and we aim to vote on all of those for which we are legally allowed to, which is almost all, apart from the Swedish companies, actually. So we're voting on over 4,000 meetings a year, which obviously requires a systemic approach. We work together with a service provider on that, put together a rule-based approach to how we're voting. Naturally, we're very supportive of reasonable climate-related resolutions, and that's a base plate in this work. But then we need to add, we need to go further than that because there are, in 3,000 companies, there are very few climate resolutions as such. We then have an overlay that comes relating to climate governance on the big emitting companies, so those that are within Climate Action 100 plus, where we take an extra look at their climate governance and would mark in our voting dissatisfaction if they are lagging behind. But then we wanted to push it a step further as well, because that's really only still a small number of companies in this big investment universe. And so what we've done is developed our own work around looking at the extreme laggards when it comes to climate disclosure and climate governance, and working on a method and an activity based on engaging with those companies ahead of voting to flag our discontent and then to follow through in our voting in order to try and push through some change. And the little picture there is not very exciting, but you might be interested to look at our website where we now publish all of our voting as it's done, as it's finished, not ahead, but after the votes. And there you can have a look at how we voted on any company over the last few years, and you can get collected statistics. So that, we believe, is also an important part of being transparent in what we're doing. I also, in the toolkit, mentioned moving the market. And as a state organisation with an ethos and a requirement to be transparent, we think we can have quite an unusual and helpful role in working with voluntary initiatives to try and push forward sustainable development. And two examples are extremely top of the agenda for us right now, because because today the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure is going to come out with an announcement, which I'm not allowed to mention because it's not time yet, but in just a few minutes we'll be coming out with some news of progress on that work, where AP7 is one of 2 asset owners that sit in the task force, and in particular Flora, my colleague, is heavily involved in. The other thing that was launched yesterday was a new standard on responsible climate lobbying. And this is a topic that we've been, at AP7, been talking about for a long time and talking to companies about for a long time. We continue to push that topic forward in collaboration with the Church of England Pension Board and BNP Paribas on this particular work to identify a standard which has been peer-reviewed and now launched yesterday. And the other side of that work is that at the same time, we're having very deep discussions with a number of European companies who we've been contacting and talking to since 2018 and asking them for more transparency, some of which have taken that step and started to publish a lobbying review, but others which have not. And there we're in quite very active talks involving the possibility of putting resolutions to the AGMs this year. So we're seeing some progress there, which is fun, and we're seeing some very dug-in heels as well, so you might see some resolutions coming up. So we'll let you know when we need your vote on that one. I thought I'd just finish by showing us what our net zero targets look like at AP7. You won't see any CO2 greenhouse gas emissions specifically on this slide. It's about what can we do. It's about our activities. What do we need to do? And we need to be working with enhanced active ownership on more companies in our portfolio. We need to work out which companies they need to be and work with them more proactively. So that's a process we're working on now through to, with goals for 2023 and 2025 and 2030. And we hope that they will lead to the results in the second row, but that's really up to how well we achieve the first row and, of course, what goes on in the rest of the world. But we need those result goals as well, but really we are focused on the activity goals as a way of getting there. That's it from me.
One question, Emma. How much of the voting is related to transition planning now? And what's the uptake been there?
I think we're seeing a big upturn in vote on climate votes this year. There are a lot of them coming through, as I believe it. I haven't got the numbers in my head, but I can follow up later. So we are seeing more of that for the very big companies, of course, but it's still a very, of our portfolio, it's a very small minority. Maybe it could be 30, 40 companies that would have a vote on climate, as it's called, this year. More that may have other climate-related resolutions.
Yep. Okay. Great. Well, thank you very much, Emma. So we're going to move to the next presentation. Victoria from Storebrand SVP is going to come and talk also a perspective on corporate governance, but specifically looking at deforestation, biodiversity. And Emma mentioned already the Tcfd, which is very important from the UN. We're very pleased to see the progress within the financial industry to the notion of nature, although we realize a lot has to be filled out there. Victoria?
Thank you. Very nice to see everyone, all my ESG colleagues, after several years now on Teams meetings. It's very nice to be here, meet you everyone. For you who doesn't know me, my name is Victoria Lidén. I work as a sustainability analyst at Storebrand Asset Management, and I'm also responsible for active ownership and corporate governance at SPP Fonder. So I'm here today also representing SPP. Johanna is usually part of this group. And I'm here to present you the example of Ipd, the Investors Policy Dialogue on Deforestation. At the outset, I would just flag that it's primarily my colleague Emine Esquiel who has been like a driving force in this initiative, working very hard. So if you have any detailed questions about this initiative, I will be very happy to set you in contact with her. But I will just give you a brief overview of this initiative and its undertakings. As financial institutions with a fiduciary duty to act in the best interest of our beneficiaries, we as investors recognize the crucial role that tropical forests and other types of natural vegetation play in tackling climate change, protecting biodiversity, and ensuring ecosystem services. But investors are concerned. We are also concerned about the financial impact that deforestation may have on our clients and our investee companies, but by potentially increasing both reputational, operational, and regulatory risks. We are also very concerned that companies exposed to deforestation in their direct operation as well as their supply chains will face increasing difficulty accessing international markets. We also see that sovereign bonds of these countries are also likely to be deemed a high risk if deforestation continues. Most countries do have some measures in place to combat deforestation, while at the same time providing favorable conditions for business and investments. However, escalating deforestation in recent years in countries rich in natural resources are creating widespread uncertainty about the conditions for investing in providing financial services to these countries. And as you all know, uncertainty is not something that investors are particularly fond of. So as investors, we want to continue to invest in these countries where deforestation is a concern and help show that economic development and the protection of the environment is not mutually exclusive. Therefore, the Ipd Initiative was formed in July 2020. The goal is to coordinate a public policy dialogue with governments, related authorities, and associations to encourage implementation of regulatory frameworks that ensure protection of forests and native vegetation. The Ipd to date is supported by a membership of 57 financial institutions from 18 countries with approximately $7.2 trillion in assets under management. And the Ipd is currently open to join until further notice, so institutional investors are welcome to join the Ipd if you want to. Ipd is governed through an advisory committee, currently co-chaired by us at Storebrand Asset Management and Blue Bay Asset Management. This advisory committee sets Ipd's strategy and direction going forward with input from the wider investor coalition and various country work streams. Secretariat support is also provided by the Tropical Forest Alliance, and the initiative is also supported by the UNPRI. So what do we want to achieve with this initiative? In the first work stream we launched, focusing on Brazil, investors are urging the government of Brazil to demonstrate clear commitment to eliminating deforestation and protecting the rights of indigenous people. Via this dialogue, we desire 5 outcomes from the Brazilian government. First, a significant reduction in deforestation rates, enforcement of Brazil's forest code, and also reinforcement of Brazil's agencies who are tasked with implementing the legislation and avoidance of any legislation that may negatively impact forest protection. We also want to see a prevention of fires in areas or near forest areas in order to avoid a repetition of fires we saw in 2019 and 2020. And finally, we also want to see public access to data on deforestation, forest cover, tenure, and traceability of commodity supply chains. Some examples of our activities during just the last year are meetings with the EU ambassador in Brazil, as well as several meetings with the relevant authorities at local and national levels. So it's both executive and legislative level. We've also engaged with Brazil's central bank. During 2021, we also launched the Indonesian working group. It was also established in addition to the Brazil working group. And several engagements have also been held with relevant Indonesian government authorities. We also sent a letter to the European Commission regarding the proposed legislation on deforestation to raise our concerns about potential loopholes in this legislation. Going forward, 2022 will be a critical year where IPDD can look to secure meaningful political commitments on deforestation, as there are some key events occurring this year, which will create what we believe is a strong political momentum. One being the UN Biodiversity Conference in China, but also this is a very important year for Brazil, which will hold general elections in October to elect the country's president, vice president, and National Congress. And our belief is that IPDD is a good platform and well positioned for fostering a policy dialogue on deforestation the coming year. So that was just a short summary of this initiative from us. If you have any questions, we can talk afterwards and also in the roundtable discussions.
Great. Okay, thank you very much, Victoria. And I think these are big conceptual issues, but then a deep dive into specific areas. Deforestation, long-standing issue. I think all of your organizations have policies on it, and I think there's a question of, is there value of working together in certain instances? And we've seen some specific examples of can we align and engaging, obviously with companies and also with governments in this instance, as we've heard. Okay, so we're going to go to our third quick presentation. Thank you very much, Victoria. We're going to hear from Karina from Alecta to talk around the notion of blended finance. Karina?
Thank you so much. I'm going to see if I can warm. Okay, thank you for inviting me. And I'm not going to talk a lot about Alecta, so I'm briefly going to say we're a mutual pension fund for occupational pensions. We manage about 120 billion dollars. And we work, as my colleagues are talking, spoke earlier to, we work in our carefully selected investment portfolio with ESG considerations across all asset classes, trying to leverage the mainstream companies in, reducing their negative impact, being more efficient, being more.
I think Karina might have to, I'm not sure that this is working, is it?
Is it? Yeah.
Okay.
I think I need to lean closer then. Maybe.
Okay.
Sorry. But what I really want to talk about is a much smaller portion of our portfolio that is very interesting for us and that has been growing over time. And that is what we're talking about, the investment that really intentionally want to have a positive impact and to make those societies and communities and nature thrive, as Victor was talking about. Maybe it sounds a bit cynical when I say growing appetite and growing opportunities, but when Alecta started investing in green bonds in 2014, that was something, it was a novelty to us, a green asset. We're financing something that's leading to environmental efficiency or environmental improvements, and that was really new to us. But within the organization, as we made more and more investments with this, the appetite grew. We were more confident about the instruments and the effect they had. But with that said, I must be frank that for these years, we've been really focused on increasing sort of the supply of these investment opportunities rather than scrutinizing very hardly whether they're deep green, light green, their actual impact. So that is something I think over time now we will see much more of. But I wanted to show you this graph because, and I realize it's hard to see in this light, but the client blue is the green bonds that we've done. And if you see, there is a darker shade of blue mounting up for the last 4 years, which is what we call investments with a social or environmental benefit, measurable impact. And those are in the forms of social bonds, and there might be other things. Several of them, a large share, are blended finance structures. And if you see the lighter blue line within here, these are, within these staples, the assets that we have according to our own definition, which sets up criteria for intentionality, additionality, and underserved segments, measuring up to our definition of impact investments. But this is something that we've been trying increasingly to find opportunities. And I think starting off with the green bonds, that was really a cultural journey within our asset management to grow an appetite for these types of investments. And in 2017, you can hardly see it, but then I think we did our first so-called impact investments of the kind, which was a blended finance structure. It was together with the Dutch DFI FMO and working with direct debt in emerging markets. And as some of you alluded to, I mean, there are, and as Javiera was talking, there are risks that are difficult for us to assess as investors. We've chosen to be exposed to certain markets directly, but with blended finance structures, we can benefit from the knowledge and experience of other actors that will reduce the risk for us as investors going into and allocate capital to those investments. And I'm really happy that last year we announced the investment that we made together with Sida using the guarantee instrument in a microfinance funding. But I also wanted to draw your attention to this, our most recent impact investment, as it relates very much more to nature. And when we talk about biodiversity, which is something that to us investors has been rather abstract to find ways to work with. In our listed equity company, of course, we can assess the policy and talk about the policy framework that we heard previous speakers talk about. But this offers us an opportunity to actually invest in environmental conservation. The Belize Blue Bond is restructuring of Belize sovereign debt, which reduced the debt cost for Belize, which is of course a country that has suffered very hard from both the COVID, but from having environmental degradation of their ecosystems, where tourism is an important economic revenue. And this is the process behind this, as was the case, I think, with the Sida guaranteed bond, is a lot of work going into this investment before it's actually realized. And an actor like Elekta, we cannot take any credit for that fact that there is something for us to invest in. We come in at the very late stage, but we offer that large-scale capital that can sort of be patient. This is a bond with a 19-year duration. And the ambition is it reduces significantly the debt costs for Belize, and at the same time it releases capital that is assigned to a fund specifically for conservation of coastline, of biodiversity within the marine ecosystem. And this could only be made possible through partly some of the guarantees offered by the US International Development Finance Company. And I think to us, with this investment, I say, what's the impact? In this case, there are some really tangible, hard things that we can measure from this investment. There will be kilometers of coastline that is set aside, that is part of conservation projects, that is being protected and registered as protected areas. There are scientific research, there are a lot of projects going on into nurturing the biodiversity and the ecosystem. But of course, it's very difficult for us to assess whether that's good enough. Do we get enough bang for the bucket, so to say? But I think we're all at a place where we cannot be too hard judging on that. Rather, we should encourage and find those kind of structures where there are those innovative partnerships where we can do this kind of finance allocation. But what's the impact and how to measure it? I think as we allocate more and more capital to it, it will become increasingly important. And we, and I think others, have been struggling to find impact measures to show also to our beneficiaries that we are creating not only financial returns, but also creating a social or an environmental impact. And in this case, of course, it offers us that opportunity. You saw the former staples for Elekta to be able to aggregate in a meaningful way what kind of impact those investments contribute to. We're simply not there yet, but I think there are very interesting initiatives to try and bridge that gap with data. We've been working with Nasdaq in the sustainable bond network, in where they try to register the sustainable bonds and actually aggregate impact measures. But I think that's just, a start of it, and we're really happy to be able to collaborate. And, repeating from what we heard previously, I think there are increasing opportunities where private and public capital can really find solutions to in a meaningful way, allocate capital where it does actually create both returns and positive impact. Thank you.
Great. So thank you, Karina. And I think what you've described, is that within Sweden, many of your organizations are moving from kind of the early testing out to how does this apply to the whole organization and the whole portfolio. And obviously, the necessarily challenges is that are the methodologies, well, they're not all there. So we can do a couple of them, we can learn from that. But then there's the double challenge. How do you do more of them? But also from the accountability perspective, how do you get? But I think, if we think of investors in most other parts of the world, I think a positive view is most others are 5 years behind on that. And they're at the earlier stage. They're probably still doing the first transactions, the first green bonds, but haven't gotten to talking about the entire fixed income portfolio and what sort of targets. And I think Sweden is ahead on that. Most of you are, which gives you leadership potential or power in terms of how can you set the examples. And where does it really make sense? Electa acting on its own, Electa acting with others and other Swedes, SISD or in other ways, or obviously with the other global networks that you're working in, PRI or others. So thank you. That's a very good lead-in, I think, to our discussion. Now we're going to break out into some groups, and I think the challenge, how can we generate, first of all, sharing, but ideas of what is it? How can we crisp about what does it take? Because you're all going through your journeys, and you're learning things, and you're seeing challenges or barriers. And I guess the question is, this group, are there things that could be, does it make sense to work together? On blended, does it make sense? Are there things we work with Sida and with the development community to try to break out? It's not only about doing great investments, it's also being transparent and accountable of what are all of the impacts, positive and negative, around those, because we can't take this to scale, certainly. I had mentioned earlier, we see a lot of power in voluntary action, but voluntary action without accountability essentially can fall down or be accusations of greenwash. So we really need to be sort of doing both at once. So I think as we go into, we're going to break out. Okay, now we get to the most challenging part of the day, which is how do we ideas, kind of throw them out. That's the easy part. How do we roll them back into something, find out where are there specific things that SISD, this group, and individual organizations can be doing. So we're going to have a quick report back from each one of the groups, quick synopsis, what was discussed, but really shifting quickly to recommendations of what can be done, both as a group, as individual organizations, and messaging, example, to governments, and including potentials for partnership with Sida and others. Corinne, are you ready to? I see you tapping furiously.
Or maybe then we'll start with...
Did you want to display also?
Okay, so Corinne, we'll come back. Do you want a minute?
Yeah. You send your presentation and then we have it all.
And
Okay.
Karin, when you're ready, can you email it to this computer, to Martina?
Okay, so let's start with Annette. Active ownership.
Do wherever you feel comfortable.
Yeah, I think you can just talk loud.
I'm not too sure actually how long am I supposed to speak? Half an hour? 3 hours?
Yeah, no,
Just briefly.
Yeah, three, four minutes.
Yeah, okay. So we discussed obviously the impact of being an owner or an asset manager. And the recommendation obviously was that governments don't make it too complicated. We're all getting hit by the new regulations. And to be quite honest, does it improve client understanding of what we're actually trying to do? Or are we just reporting a lot of stuff that is not making any use or anyone understanding? So don't make it too complicated. We want to make an impact in the real world, not just shove unsustainable investments to someone else, obviously, because that's not what we want to do. We want to be involved in the transition. And to be able to do that, we need a transparency for companies. And if we haven't got transparency on reporting from companies, we can't make the right decision and we can't be part of the transition. So transparency and reporting from the companies is vital. Otherwise, we won't make our goal. And also, in the end, all of us, I think, or most of us, has made a lot of commitments on what we're going to try and achieve. And the proof is in the pudding. We have to actually deliver on our promises and not just sort of like shy away and said that, oh, for this and that reason, we didn't reach the goal. And we would have to have some really good explanations on why we didn't and make a new stance to do better and improve ourselves.
Okay, so maybe if I could ask, just to dig a little bit on what you've raised, in terms of don't make it too complicated, how do you see the relationship between investors disclosing on information and regulatory action? You have the EU taxonomy, it's still new, it's complicated. How would you see, assuming the taxonomy is going to be an important tool, it's not the only one, but it's sort of at the center of this process, what would be your recommendation on what does that mean to not make it too complicated, thinking about the taxonomy as an example?
I think that we need the taxonomy, even though it's not perfect and it never will be. But unfortunately, I think it's too complicated, so a lot of investors don't understand what the taxonomy is. And sustainability as a whole is extremely complex, and they've tried to take something extremely complex, try to make it simple, but made it even more complex to understand what is what. So I think that they sort of like lost the objective of the game. And working with private clients, as we do as well as institutional clients, we produce so many different reports on what we do on sustainability and measure everything, but no one understands what that actually means. Is it good or bad? I mean, we do publish our carbon footprint on our funds, and it's like, 3.2 tons of CO2, is that good or bad? No idea. Compared to what? And is that making an impact? So I think we have to try and understand that sustainability is a complex area, and we have to let it be complex. And as one of my colleagues actually said in the group, it's a scale of gray. Nothing is black or white, basically. Everything is different shades of gray. And we just have to understand that and accept it for what it is. And I think media is not helping us because we get targeted for having investment in sort of like brown companies, where we sort of want to be invested in those because we're trying to push them to become more sustainable. But then again, then we get some bad reputation in the press, which obviously it's not very good. So we sort of like hit between the rock and a hard place. We want to do the right thing, but we get criticized for doing the right thing. And it's just something that I think that we as an industry have to face, but I think that we could work more together because then we'll become stronger and we can sort of like push back and get a message out there that we're actually trying to do something good. And the reason why we're doing it is because we want to transform the world. We want to invest in what's good and not divest, but maybe in the end divest from things that are not working in the right direction.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. I think you framed probably what most organizations in the room have a sense of the current challenging, somewhat ambiguous situation that we're in. Expectations are rising, frameworks and standards are rising, but obviously there's a challenge because they're not all there, or they're not necessarily solving the problem they're set out to solve.
I think that with all the new regulation that is coming and all the reporting that we have to do, they have lost sight of who is the client, who is actually receiving this message, are they understanding it? And I think they lost that with the new framework.
Last question for you at this point. The shift towards transition, be it net zero or there can be other versions of that, does that make something that the taxonomy more useful because you know what you're using it for? And obviously the taxonomy has within it what you call it the green assets ratio. Does that help make it easier, or it's just too makes it more complicated because the underlying methodologies are not proven out, therefore it's, when you add them all up in terms of transition, it remains very blurry?
I would say it's kind of blurry because still the taxonomy still is a very small portion of the investable universe. So the major part is not assessed. So it's kind of hard to discuss saying, oh, this is a product which is very sustainable because it's the eligibility and alignment of the taxonomy is high. It's 5%. It's like, what about the other 95? Is that bad? So no, it's just not assessed. And that's where I think also it's kind of complicated for people to understand that 5% could be really, really good.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think you've framed out some of the challenges, and I think many of you would be aware within the taxonomy, the discussion over gas and nuclear, was a very tricky one. And that was before Ukraine. So it puts, all of Europe in a terribly complicated situation within the realm of sustainability transition and all of the associated transitions, including on energy. So second, Karin?
Yeah, thank you. So we had great discussions in our group, I must say. And the group asked me to present, but they have promised to fill in. And any questions from you, Eric, has to be posted to the group, of course. Let's see here now. This group wanted to suggest that SISD proposed to the global community to adhere and to work on a list that actually owners have to work with when being owners. So we wanted to start off by the AP7 list on how they engage as owners and maybe add a few things to it. But to communicate this to GIST and the rest of the investors that are present at Stockholm Plus 50, that this is a good way to go, working as owners. And then the group suggested, well, there are a few good initiatives that have just started. For example, SEC, the US Securities and Exchange Commission, and EU, they ask for transparency around CO2 emissions. When it comes to SEC, the 500 largest companies in the US, they have to be transparent about their CO2 emissions. And this was a very good initiative, the group thought, but this has to be applicated also to the rest of the world. So through GIST maybe, and through other channels, and through this conference, this could be advocated also from SISD, that the rest of the world has to adhere to those transparency requests. And in addition to that, many investors in the SEC have also to be transparent about how they voted in sustainability issues. And the group recommends that this should also be applicated to the rest of the world. And the group also recommended that this initiative that has been taken from SEC now on the 500 largest companies should also be included in the wider global context. State-owned companies that often don't follow rules, etc. in certain countries, but they should also be included, and SMEs, small and medium companies also. One thing that we really discussed in the beginning of the meeting was the need for a good basis and a good analysis the actions related to climate from investors should be based at. But we also said that the perfect should not be enemy of the good, of course. But two good recommendations on frameworks to look at is transition pathway, I think from the beginning of Swedish Initiative, and science-based targets. The group also discussed a lot around the potential of voting and thought that voting will become more important in the future. So owners will raise things to voting. And there was one discussion on to agree on a point that is mandatory today on the annual general meeting, that if investors wanted to show that they are disappointed with the climate actions, that they should vote no to that point, following the example of BlackRock, for example, that is now discussed on Ericsson and that they earlier performed on Volvo. And another idea was to introduce a mandatory bullet at the AGMs all over the world on climate adaptation and net zero plans. So the companies would be mandatorily, they would have to report on how they are doing and what they are planning when it comes to net zero 2050. The group also thought that they could be test pilots for Tcfd, the new initiative that AP7 is engaged on. And we discussed on the possibility to link climate ambitions to bonus systems and remuneration systems, and the group thought that was good, and they said, well, this is already starting. How could we move it forward? Maybe we could start thinking about a framework around this, a good practice that could be global on this point, how to connect the climate ambitions of a company to the bonus systems of the CEOs and top management. They thought a shaming list to reach the untouchables, those state-owned companies and small and medium companies that are not included in other shaming lists, could be a good idea. And most of the other things I have said, don't break through already open doors, where you were saying, however, we often speak in a European context, but it should be acknowledged also that the rest of the world are a little bit behind on these issues, and including NIC countries, emerging markets, and developing economies, etc. And then again, transparency around investors voting also in the rest of the world is important to work on. And this, of course, because the policy holders and savers need to know how the investors have voted with their assets. Anything to add, please?
I think just for your understanding, I wouldn't say that these are recommendations from the group, but rather different practices that we were
discussing and reflecting about. And many of these practices we concluded were not really for the global arena yet, because we can't impose things on a global scale. Some of the practices are actually based in EU regulation already or in US regulation. So it was more of a exploring different practices rather than recommendations for us. I just wanted to add.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of comes back to the point around the grey, everything being a shade of grey. I mean, I think we talked about these, and certainly my impression is none of these are perfect and would need a lot more work before there's something that could go and be, proposed. We were certainly, there was very exploratory discussions, I guess we'd say. Yeah.
Thank you for that.
I actually have a question regarding the shaming list. Our experience is actually to put a company on a shaming list, the investor dialogue becomes not so very fruitful. So any comments on that? Because normally we think that we can discuss difficult issues behind closed doors with companies, but not officially.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point.
I definitely have a comment on that one. Don't we, Flora? So AP7 is very public on its blacklisted companies, a real classic shaming list in many ways. But before we do that, we contact the company 6 months before and say, hey, you've come up on our radar. This is the problem. What we'd like to see is this. Otherwise, we'll be making a decision in 6 months. So in the last few months, we've received, from the list of companies that we've contacted in this 6 months blacklisting, I would say more than 70% of the companies have provided information to us and got back to us and requested meetings. So it has ahead of the blacklisting, there is a value, and hopefully some of those companies won't be blacklisted based on what they've been able to provide to us.
So you mentioned the 6 months period that we give them, but before that we also have, we have long running also engagement dialogues with companies, and it's always a balance. Should we blacklist or not, or should we continue to engage in dialogue or vote? But that's a whole different discussion.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much, Claudia. And I think a lot of ideas you put up there, and I think Annette, you mentioned earlier kind of the challenge of leaders. Often the more data you put out there, actually you expose yourself to criticism, and there are some others who keep their head in the sand and often get off easier because it's hard to criticize someone who doesn't give you any numbers to criticize. So I think it poses a challenge, and I guess a question for a group like SISD, you working together, are there some things where it makes sense to do it in concert? And I guess just thinking, shameless, I think in certain forms, carefully done, has value. I wonder, you mentioned, Karin, issues like unlisted parts. If we talk about the financial sector, there are parts of the sector that are less transparent. And as Larry Fink in Glasgow, himself pointed out, it's not going to help much if we just divest assets and pass them on to, shadow markets who just continue to operate them. I wonder, could you, not so much a shame list, but maybe more a challenge list? Could investors who are all fairly transparent, you're challenging each other, but because you are, can you challenge other communities? And I'm thinking about other parts of the financial community, and to say, we're doing this, we're transparent in these ways, why aren't you? And in a similar way to governments, and basically saying, we see from a risk perspective, important to act on climate, but we're quite concerned that you don't have an NDC which is fit for purpose, etc. Or you have a sovereign wealth fund who seems to be disconnected from your NDC. So there are, a lot of imperfections. And I guess the question is, these are probably issues that it's very hard for you individually to message about, but maybe as a group, there are some things that actually make sense to do together. And when it comes down to a lot of this is about messaging and communications. And I think one of the biggest challenges you have, and I have in my work, is frankly, when you talk to the person on the street, often they will say, it's all bullshit. They really have a hard time believing that the finance industry is up to any good. And I think we just have to understand that, and I don't know Sweden as well as you all, but I have the sense that that's certainly often a challenge. Not to say that the response is only good communications, but I think it's in terms of getting the messaging right. Sometimes doing things as a group can have particular power. And I think part of it is trying to show that you can make certain asks and challenges to other because you are more accountable, and these are the ways in which you're accountable. Things like compensation, transparency on voting, and not to say that everyone, all of you in the room are going to be, have the exact same policy, but there are some areas where I think you more or less can say we're on one level, but other parts of the financial sector is not there yet. So let's challenge them, in a positive way. I don't know, just ideas. And I think around the idea, we were talking a little bit before around the notion of communications. Is there something, you all have communications departments, maybe, and I'm sure that they're pretty good on sustainability issues, because that's a big part of what you do, but maybe the departments should be meeting themselves to be talking through these issues. I know, as I mentioned earlier, we deal mostly with banking, and to be frank, most of what our communications department does today on banking is defensive, because the banks are so easy, and just reason, they're bashed every single day. And so I think it is a challenge. It indicates they need to do more, but it's also, it poses this challenge about how do you foster voluntary leadership from within a market where whoever makes an announcement will get bashed. So I think there is some thinking to be done around how do we message, how do we challenge the other parts of the economy. Okay, we're going to have the third presentation.
Eric, just before we get
Yep.
there, in the second group, we actually talked quite a bit about this specific point on communications. And I think someone said, we need to educate the media, and we know how bad that sounds, but nevertheless, it's somehow, it was really something that we discussed for some time, because we really felt that or you felt that you are becoming defensive too easily, because we can't really get the message across. So, yeah, sorry.
Very good. Hannah.
Yes.
Blended.
Yes, blended. Okay, so I mean, there were three of us in our group. We don't have too much notes, so I'll do my best to summarize what we discussed. We had some really interesting discussions. There were three investors with really interesting exposure in these markets coming from different angles. So, but looking at first point, when it comes to governments, we did talk a lot about guarantees and how useful they are for us as investors. And I mean, it depends on if you invest a lot in larger infrastructure projects. There are, I mean, MEGA guarantees, political risk guarantees, which are very useful, EKN guarantees. And we really see that this type of tool can really be developed further. We know Sida's guarantee, and we discussed whether or not you could do a more of a off-the-shelf type of product that would be more accessible for, like myself, for example, a fund manager in Sweden. So my group members, please interrupt and fill in if I miss something. Then we talk a little bit about the multilateral institutions, and here, like DFIs. And we, our main message to these institutions is that they need to take more risk, and they need to take the right type of risk. They should not compete with me or my, friends when it comes to financing, because that's something that we see. Everybody wants the nice risks, and so does the DFIs. So I think that is a really, really important message. I mean, they should be there to mobilize capitals, leverage more capital. So that is a really, that's a strong message that we have in our group, I think. And also, I think, we did also, maybe that's on government levels, liquidity. We invest in quite illiquid assets, but to be able to get more investors in this asset class, we need to make those assets liquid. And that is a huge challenge. In our funds, we only have institutional investors, but if we could make them a bit more liquid, we would be able to get so much more investments from individuals, for example. And I think that's the way where we should talk more. We can try to, I mean, is there any way we can develop any type of new guarantee? But it could also be on regulatory level, I guess, because it's the regulatory environment that sort of is the hinder here. And also when it comes to companies, I think we discussed a little bit about the fact that there's like these top picks of companies that everybody wants to invest in. So I think that, I think it comes back to, who should do what. DFIs should try to broaden their scope, looking at upcoming companies. Now I'm talking within maybe like the solar space, renewables, infrastructure. So, yeah, I think that was about it. Do you want to fill in?
Can I ask a question? My understanding of Sweden is strong local government, and a lot of new technology gets demonstrated at the communal level, say new energy or environmental technologies. Is this a model that has been replicated, has been used, promoted elsewhere? I mean, I know, Alan, you're talking about strong support to municipalities. Is there learning or more that can be done around how you create public-private risk sharing, or, essentially needed to evolve or test out and deploy technology? Is that a concerted effort or an area of expertise within Sweden, both public and private?
I'm not sure if I'm the right person to.
Maybe that's a question for Sida. I don't know.
Yeah. Not sure.
Leave it as an open question. Yeah, exactly. I think the issue you point out about the challenge around crowding in versus crowding out is a really, I think, a tough one within a context that multilateral institutions unfortunately end up competing when they probably shouldn't. And I can see that in the UN, you see this, in terms of mandate overlap and otherwise. And the question is how to address it. I guess the question once again is Swedish investors working together, and I think this is what you had suggested. You can be first buyers, first users of platforms. For instance, that can provide more liquidity. I don't know, green bond platforms. And I know that there have been some attempts. I think of the Amundi one. What is this called? There was a fund of funds for green bonds that was launched a couple of years ago, and I'm not sure where it's at today. What's it called? Right. Okay. So some of you probably know that. I'm wondering. Are these the models that are because there is multilateral finance in that, and then you have a commercial actor who's managing a platform. I don't know where the best practice is, and have Swedes taken a leading position in testing these? And obviously not all of them are going to be successful, but I think the challenge you pose, the issue of unless there can be sufficient liquidity.
No, I mean, we are trying to create a market because, I mean, when we invest, so our funds, we invest in local microfinance institutions or solar companies in these markets. And we have this partner, Symbiotics, who has a market access platform, and they actually help these institutions issuing bonds. But, I mean, those are not traded, but we are trying to sort of, by increasing the demand for these bonds and also increasing the amount of investors in this market, we do see that there is a market being established and potentially, and we're hoping that they will be more liquid. But then for our funds, we are impact funds, so we're probably gonna stop investing at the time when they are liquid and when they are so.
Right, but others will come in.
Yes, exactly. So that's how it's supposed to work.
Right, absolutely. Any other comments or questions around this tricky risk sharing? What's the role of public? Where does the public sector sometimes, whatever multilaterals, overstep, or what could be done more? It's a tough space. The problem is, as you said, if it was easy, you wouldn't need the public sector. So it's navigating, and this is obviously what you're dealing with on a daily basis.
Yeah. But we are happy to discuss this.
Great.
We should do it together.
Any other ideas? We're coming towards the end, and I think we're it's a lot of things that tick around in your head in terms of how do you make sense of this shape. What is it? And once again, I think you're involved in many things around these topics. You're doing a lot. You're not really new to this. You've been doing it for quite some time. I think you're getting more sophisticated. The market expectations are very quickly getting more sophisticated in things like the taxonomy, which is not an easy thing. And it was designed largely for investors. There are many others, like banks and insurers, who are just like, how do you make sense of this? Extremely challenging. You have a very ambitious government in Sweden, I think in Brussels, on these topics, which is good, but it can also create expectations which are very challenging. So then I think it then comes back to then again the issue of what is it that Sweden, how can it differentiate yourselves as a group? In some cases, figure out some things that make sense to do together. And to, if it's just coming together every so often, to compare who's doing what, you know, what is best practice, and push each other a little bit, and push governments. I think that's good as well. Anybody else have ideas or questions around that? Maybe from the Sida side, Alan, or anyone, in terms of what you would see useful to get out of such a discussion, or expectations for the...
Sure. I could say a few words from the Sida side. Maybe I'll just stand up if it's okay. And our time's coming to an end too, so I'll also take advantage of the moment to say some thank yous.
Are you closing now?
I don't know.
I didn't mean to close right away. I'm still in talk mode.
You're still in talk mode, then we won't close. I do have a few closing words, but I'll save them. And I'll just note that the conversation so far is very material to what we're doing at Sida. And we're searching for the sweet spots that people have been discussing, that you were asking about all the time. And there's a certain, as we all know, opportunism in the work that we all do. What opportunities present themselves, but then you sort them based on where are you most needed, and or where do you get the biggest multipliers. And so at Sida, we're sort of doing both all the time. It's a dance. We heard that word earlier today. But it's a dance that you have to do with partners. So, you know, if there's a market, we shouldn't be there, for example. But we should be where there could be a market. That requires some very careful calibrating, and it requires also dialogue, because you know where there might be a market better than we know, but we know where we think there should be a market. So I think that dialogue needs to be developed further. That's all I have to say for now.
Great. Thank you very much, Alan. I think it poses, I think the ask essentially is the opportunity to, have an engagement, public-private, in terms of as these markets start to, I don't know if you solidify, but as they mature, essentially, making sure that the signaling is efficient in both directions. And as I said earlier, not only between public and private, but also to the media, to the person on the street, to try to explain. And I know obviously it's a challenge, development of cooperation. How do you communicate that? Responsible investors, how do you communicate that? And in some cases, it can be done together. It makes sense. Some cases, it's rather different. Can I call? Okay, comments here.
Yeah, underlining comment. Because I just got a notice now during this meeting that unfortunately there is. For January and February this year, there's a record deforestation in Brazil. It's record high, more than last year. So I think what we really need to understand and underline is the urgency we're all in, and we have to come back to the real world impact. And we discussed that in our group, and we really need to point to that when we have all these journalists hunting us from whatever we're invested in or not invested in. And sort of try to push back so we can get some room to actually do the work, because we don't get that today. We're already too busy to sort of communicate. And we don't have the time to read all the reports to really do some really good engagement and improvements and so on. And when I get news like this news flash, and I get really stressed, and I think we need to sort of prove to the man on the street that it's not bullshit. We're actually we're running as fast as we can, but we need to sort of help each other to not have these sort of hindrances that we need to jump over all the time when we're running, because we're getting exhausted by doing that. So I think we need to sort of point to that we have this urgency, and we really need to continue running, but help each other out, and not have this communication competition.
I think one of the challenges in the financial sector is normally you don't like to speak until you have the answer. And the problem is it's a work in progress. It's continuously a work in progress. And I think part of the notion is how do you communicate that so that people understand that so much work is underway, but it's also, it's not as simple as people often I think part of the blame to the media is they oversimplify, that's their job, but it's not always that helpful. So I think it once again comes back to the question of, is there a common forms of media engagement or communication that can be useful? And I think to some extent from certain media, I think they welcome the opportunity to have discussions. At the end of the day, their articles might not always be so holistic, but I think it's a useful potential opportunity. Jenny.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm just relating back to the discussion we had in our group as well on the need for really following through and follow up. It's not just about all the things that we do. And SISD has been a fantastic platform to share experiences, to learn, to discuss best practices. And I just want to highlight, it's not just about communication, I think. It's also about engagement. How do we reach out with all the things that we are already doing? Who do we talk to really follow through and be able to follow up? Is that rather an engagement plan, outreach plan, than a communication plan? Is there something in that the platform that SISD could engage in? Just to pose a question out there.
Okay. Anybody else? Okay, good. Now, I will shortly call Alan up for a second time on the thank you side. Yeah. Okay. So are you ready to go on with that right away then? I think, yeah. Yeah, I think we're at time, so we should probably...
Yeah. No, good. So just a few words about the next steps. And first of all, thank you from our side as well for very good discussions today. I think it's been really interesting, both with the examples given by all the presenters, by the challenges you posed to us, Victor, the urgency, as well as the group discussions that I think pointed out many things that we need to continue to work with together. We'll try to reflect this in a chair summary. We'll do our best and we'll send it around for you to add on and check that the most important things are in there. We also highlighted in the concept note that we shared with you, and this relates to the second question that all the groups discussed. Are there any commitments that we think we want to do, either as own business or as SISD, as a platform, or in our engagement with other business communities, be it GISD or other platforms, networks that we're in? Are there any commitments that we think we really need to stress in the light of Stockholm Plus 50 and in the communication kind of leading up to that, stressing the urgency also that Victor so clearly pointed out? So I leave that as a bit of a cliffhanger for us to continue to discuss if there is interest to do so, put into words and action this urgency. So I'll leave it at that.
The recommendations to the global community. Yeah.
Absolutely. So we'll share the chair summary with you, and we'll continue the conversation about the commitments, if we use that word. And again, thank you from all of us to you.
Great, thank you very much. And David, thank you for the summary. And as you said, we will return that into a proper note in terms of follow-up. So now, Alan, back to you.
Okay, I'll be very brief. Of course, mostly I'm going to say thank you, but first I'm going to say a few words that I snapped up from these wonderful reports. At the end, it became a little like poetry. Phrases like transparent simplicity, or compared to what, or between a brown rock and a gray hard place, being test pilots for net zero, Grace periods precede shaming lists. From shame to challenge. De-risk and go liquid to scale up. And finally, show that what is possible is already real. I think that was the communication challenge that we spent a lot of our time talking about. That SISD, the members of that network, are proving that a transition is possible, is happening, and we need to be better as a whole community, Sida included, at communicating the work that we do so that it sets an even better example for the world. I personally found this dialogue incredibly valuable, not something you can easily set a number on for all of us who like to measure our progress and success, but I hope that you also found it very valuable. And I also just mostly want to thank Eric, as our moderator, all our speakers, Victor earlier, the team that put this together, Jenny, Corinne, Eric, David. I'm sure I'm going to be forgetting some names. Emma for speaking earlier as well, Hannah, and several others. But mostly I want to thank all the members of this community, the SISD community and the people around it, because I think we have found something of a leverage point here in Sweden. We know we can have a global impact. Our dialogues matter. So let this be the start of a several-month period of dialogue that we hope will take us into the Stockholm Plus 50 conference and from there out to the world with even more impact. From Sida's side, thank you all very much.